In March 1978, on a windy Thursday outside Concordia, Kansas, 24-year-old Hank Murray signed for his first 40 acres at a purchase price of $28,000, put down $11,200 he had stacked from custom harvest wages, and carried a 10-year fixed note on the remaining $16,800 at 8.25%. The numbers were precise enough to fit on one page. The man signing them looked like he could not cover lunch. He stepped out of a 1969 Chevrolet C20 with rusted rocker panels, 312,000 miles, and a tailgate held closed by baling wire and a bent chain link. His overalls were patched at both knees. His boots had somebody else's initials still carved into the leather. At the Reno County Co-op line and the Hutchinson coffee shops, those details became his biography in other people's mouths. People said 40 acres was a starter patch, a temporary hold, a salvage plan. They saw an unpainted farmhouse, an old truck, and faded caps drying on a nail near the porch and called it struggle. They did not know he had calculated his annual land payment to the dollar before he ever made an offer. At 8.25% over 120 months, his payment sat near $206 per month, about $2,472 per year. And he had built his budget on a worse crop year than he had actually seen. Appearance looked like failure. Arithmetic looked like control. That contrast had started a decade earlier, and it had started in pain quiet enough that no one outside the family remembered it correctly. In late 1968, Hank was a boy on leased ground his father did not own. The lease covered 160 acres west of town. Then rates rose, yields slipped, and a variable operating line climbed faster than grain checks. By spring 1969, the landlord shifted terms, then shifted tenants. Hank watched equipment loaded in silence, his father staring at a paper he folded and unfolded at the kitchen table until the corners turned soft. No sheriff scene, no shouting, just land gone, because land not titled in your name could vanish without warning. His father said one sentence that stayed with him longer than any sermon. If a note can move, it can bite. Hank later translated that into policy. Never finance machinery new, never carry variable debt, never let annual payments exceed 1/3 of worst year net cash flow. He was not anti-growth. He was anti-fragility. By the summer of 1973, he had finished school and gone where wages were available, joining custom harvest crews that cut wheat north through Kansas into Nebraska and beyond, sleeping light, eating cheap, and sending cash home instead of spending it in town bars. He tracked every season in a black notebook with feed-stained edges. 1973 wages, $4,860 gross, $3,740 saved. 1974, $5,430 gross, $4,180 saved. 1975, hail damage cut hours, $4,210 gross, $3,020 saved. 1976, long run and strong yields, $6,040 gross, $4,950 saved. 1977, equipment breakdowns and fewer miles, $5,120 gross, $3,310 saved. Total saved over 5 seasons, $19,200. He used $11,200 for the down payment and held the rest as operating cushion, seed money, and repair reserve. Earl Jensen noticed him before anyone else did. Earl was older, compact, and known for equipment that looked tired from the road and perfect in the field. He did not offer speeches. He offered examples. He showed Hank how to buy one piece that could be rebuilt instead of one package that needed monthly worship. He taught him to carry a parts ledger beside the checkbook because deferred maintenance and foolish financing could ruin a farm by different routes with the same ending. One September evening, with invoices spread under a yellow kitchen light, Earl tapped the margin of Hank's notebook and said, "Cash flow first, pride last." The first 40 acres did not turn him into anything overnight. It gave him a controlled test. Wheat on part, milo on part, forage where it fit, and strict limits on fixed obligations. Property tax, insurance, input costs, and the land note were entered before household spending. The house itself stayed plain. Unpainted siding, repaired windows. One room cooled in summer, one room heated hardest in winter. He logged household expenses in 1979 at $11,940 all in, including food, fuel, clothing, utilities, and church giving. Low overhead was not deprivation to him. It was optionality he could deploy later. By the second week of October 1979, co-op chatter had already settled into a story about him that would follow him for years. Too cautious, too small, too attached to old iron. He heard all of it while buying discounted seed and bearings in bulk lots. He did not argue much. He kept receipts. The pressure rose in September 1981 at a lot sale in Cloud County, where shiny paint and financing brochures made urgency feel like weather. Travis Cole, the dealer everyone knew, came in clean-shaven, pressed shirt, polished boots, and a new pickup carrying dealer plates and chrome bright enough to mirror the sky. He spotted Hank near a row of used tractors and walked over with practiced confidence. "You are still doing this one field at a time," Travis said, voice loud enough for nearby bidders. "I can put you in a new 4640 package today. $62,400, 18.9% financing. Real operators use leverage. Cash buyers stay small forever." He laughed after he said it, full in public. Hank looked at the 4640, then at a used 4430 with tired paint and good bones. He bid $10,700, won it, and loaded it for home. Over the next weeks, he spent $1,960 on parts, did the labor himself, and brought it back to field-ready condition with no monthly machinery payment attached to it. 3 weeks later, he sat at his kitchen table, legal pad on one side, amortization sheet on the other, and ran the comparison line by line. The dealer package at 18.9% implied roughly $1,316 per month before fuel, filters, or repairs, which was $15,792 per year in fixed obligation just to service equipment debt. His paid-off route on the rebuilt 4430 left him around $14,500 each year that could be directed to land principal, emergency reserve, and input flexibility. One path bought shine and stress. The other bought time and title. He set his pencil down, looked through the kitchen window at the field edge in the dark, and understood this was the point where appearance and outcome started separating for real. The family split arrived almost immediately. Hank's younger brother, Leon, chose the dealer path on 320 rented acres near Reno County. The first year looked bigger on paper, and for a season, the bigger look felt like proof. Newer machinery, larger rent footprint, aggressive planting pace. At Thanksgiving, the brothers were cordial, then quiet, passing dishes and talking in short turns. Hank never called Leon reckless. Leon never called Hank prudent. They spoke mostly in acre counts and weather updates, which is how farm families sometimes discuss worry without naming it. In town, the surface narrative still held. Hank remained the man with the old truck and patched knees. Travis remained the man associated with growth, momentum, and modern scale. Yet under that visible layer, records were forming. Hank had a one-land note fixed at 8.25%, controlled machinery exposure, and a rule that annual payments could never outrun one-third of worst-year net cash flow. He would test that rule against drought, export weakness, interest shocks, and the ordinary bad luck every producer meets. The people watching him saw worn denim and rust. Hank saw principal reduction schedules and acres that could not be called away once paid for. The next morning, Hank parked the 1969 Chevrolet C20 beside the grain office in Hutchinson, the truck leaning slightly to the left where an old spring had sagged years earlier. Dust sat in the corners of the windshield. The tailgate chain rattled when he shut the door. Inside, two men in clean, insulated jackets stood at the counter discussing prepaid fertilizer programs and spring equipment rebates, one of them carrying a folder with a dealer logo stamped in silver. Hank waited behind them in patched overalls with a grease mark at the thigh and a cap so sun-faded that the original color could only be guessed. He stepped up when his turn came and asked for posted rates on bulk urea, dry phosphorus, and diesel for contract delivery, then asked for the penalty structure on late spring pickup. The clerk glanced at him, then at the truck keys in his hand, and answered in a softer voice than he had used with the men ahead of him, as if he were simplifying terms for someone who would not close a purchase. Hank asked one more question, precise and flat. If I take 32 tons and pay in 10 days, what is the per-ton reduction to the cent? The clerk checked the ledger, looked back up, and gave him the number. $4.75 per ton discount for 10-day settlement. Hank nodded, pulled a folded check from his notebook, and wrote a deposit of $5,000 against spring inputs while the other two men paused mid-conversation. Specific money changed the room before anyone admitted it. When Hank turned to leave, Travis Cole stood in the doorway with polished boots and a tan coat that still held the crease from the hanger. He smiled at Hank with practiced ease and looked at the old truck through the glass. "You still making business decisions with that thing in the parking lot?" he asked. Hank slid the receipt into his pocket and answered in 7 words. "The truck is not on my balance sheet." He drove back toward Concordia on a 2-lane road lined with winter wheat stubble and windbreaks stripped nearly bare. At a stop sign outside a small feed yard, he reached across the bench seat, opened the black notebook Earl Jensen had once told him to guard better than his wallet, and added 3 lines while the engine idled. Urea contract deposit, $5,000. 10-day discount value at 32 tons, $152. Expected spring fuel commitment, 1,900 gallons. Target price ceiling $1.08. Then he wrote what mattered most to him in margins that no one else saw. No monthly machinery note added. What looked like stubbornness from the outside was a structure he had tested too many times to ignore. The memory that sat under every line item was still his father coming home after the lease loss, papers folded and unfolded at the same table, until the corners broke down, because variable debt had moved faster than yield and rent could recover. Years later, on auction grounds with Earl, Hank had watched men bid hardest on equipment that looked like relief and hesitate on ground that held value when iron depreciated. Earl had leaned close once and said it where only Hank could hear. Pretty paint has monthly terms. Dirt has decades. So even now, with prices and pressure pushing everyone toward bigger notes, Hank still built from floor numbers first and pride last. He ran worst likely yields, worst likely prices, then stripped away seed, chemical, fuel, tax, insurance, and repair reserves before allowing any debt service onto the page. If annual fixed payments rose past one-third of stressed net cash flow, he rejected the deal regardless of who called him timid. He had applied that test to machinery he wanted badly, and written no in the margin when the payment load climbed toward 40% in poor year conditions. He had applied it again in the shop, separating repairs into what protected uptime and what merely protected ego. Functional repairs got money. Vanity repairs waited. One season of belts, bearings, hoses, and a rebuilt starter had cost him hundreds, where a financed replacement would have cost him thousands, and the spread had gone where he cared about it most, into land control. Winter tightened around north-central Kansas as planting decisions moved from talk into commitments. In the first week of February 1982, Hank sat at the kitchen table before daylight and built the year on one clean page. Expected operating costs: seed $7,840, fertilizer $11,920 net of discount, chemical $4,360, fuel $2,014, insurance and tax allocations $3,280, repairs reserve $3,600, total $33,014, expected gross under conservative yield price assumptions $51,900, planned net before debt service and household $18,886. Existing annual fixed debt obligations, including land note and minor carryover input note, $18,740. Thin margin, but within rule because one-third threshold was calculated on worst year net cash flow that year at $57,000 over total controlled production, including custom work. He still had breathing room if he avoided new fixed commitments. He lived in a way that made those margins workable. Household spending for 1981 closed at $12,480. Food $3,260, utilities $1,940, fuel and transport $2,180, clothing $320, church and local giving $1,100, home maintenance $1,480, medical and miscellaneous $2,200, no vacations finance, no consumer note, no symbolic upgrades. He replaced what failed and repaired what could be repaired. The farmhouse remained unpainted because paint did not lower interest expense. Word traveled the way it always did, through coffee counters and fence line pauses, and by March, the talk around county sales yards split cleanly between men scaling fast and men trying not to get trapped by monthly obligations. At a consignment sale outside Salina, that divide showed up in plain sight. A used grain drill with worn markers and a stiff opener arm drew little attention because its finish looked rough and one tire was weather-checked. Hank had inspected it the day before, measured wear against parts availability, and set a hard cap of $1,150. Bidding stalled at $900. He bought it for $925, loaded it himself, and later spent $146 on opener discs and bearings plus 6 hours of labor. Comparable financed replacement package, the dealer had quoted another buyer that morning, was $8,400 at 13.6% over 48 months. Monthly $228, annual $2,736. Hank's total cash outlay, $1,071 and no monthly payment. Over 4 years, the payment path would have cost about $10,944 before repair variance. His path left roughly $9,873 available for land principal or reserve. The same month, Leon expanded rented ground and accepted additional equipment financing tied to projected yield improvements. Leon was not foolish, and Hank knew it. Leon was trying to keep pace with the system that rewarded visible scale, and for one decent season, that strategy often looked smart. At family supper, Leon spoke about speed, acres covered per day, and harvest windows lost to breakdown risk. Hank listened, nodded, and asked one question he asked everyone, including himself. "What is the payment if wheat drops?" Leon answered with confidence, then changed the subject to weather. Their disagreement was economic, but it landed as personal because brothers hear warning as judgment even when no judgment is spoken. Travis kept pressing from the other side of the same argument, never missing a chance to frame caution as small thinking. At the elevator, one windy afternoon, he told a half-circle of growers that a man who would not leverage in a growth cycle had already chosen to stay small forever. Nobody answered him directly. Hank checked a moisture slip, folded it into his pocket, and headed back to the truck. The old Chevrolet coughed once before catching. Travis watched him pull away and smiled like he had made his point. By late April, Hank had formalized maintenance rotations that looked obsessive to outsiders and rational to anyone who tracked downtime costs. Oil intervals were logged by engine hours, filters bought in bulk when off-season pricing dipped, and parts cannibalization decisions made from a written priority list so no impulse purchase happened in a panic. One breakdown prevented in planting season could preserve a yield window worth thousands. He estimated the system saved him 3.8 field days in 1982 compared with the prior 3-year average, which at his acreage and yield profile translated into revenue protection near $4,200 under conservative pricing. No one at the coffee shop asked about preventive maintenance math. They asked why he still drove that truck. He let them ask. Their misread gave him room. People who judged by paint and chrome did not notice early settlement discounts added up across fertilizer and fuel. They did not notice how often he used fixed terms when debt was unavoidable, and how hard he resisted variable exposure after watching what it had done once already. They did not notice that he carried reserve targets for poor seasons rather than average ones, or that every avoided payment widened his options when weather or prices turned mean. Through all of it, Hank remained understated to the point that people mistook quiet for uncertainty. He did not give speeches. He did not tell other producers they were wrong. He kept collecting small advantages, discounts for early settlement, salvage value from the careful repairs, fixed rate terms when debt was unavoidable, and cash reserves, sized to cover poor seasons rather than average ones. Looked at from a road shoulder, he still appeared undercapitalized. Faded cap, patched knees, an old Chevrolet with rust and a wired tailgate. Looked at through his ledgers, he was building exactly what he intended to build, one obligation avoided and one principal payment at a time. By the last week of May, 1982, Hank had seed in the ground, fertilizer commitments locked, and one sheet of paper taped inside a cabinet door with 3 numbers written in pencil. Fixed obligations, $18,740. Minimum reserve target, $12,000. And maximum new annual payment allowed $0 unless gross projections rose by at least $9,500. He checked those numbers more often than weather radio. The summer came hot, then uneven, with rain missing some fields by a mile. At harvest, he cleared less than he had hoped, but more than his stressed plan. Gross receipts of $56,480, total operating and household outflow of $48,960, and year-end surplus of $7,500 to $20. He sent $5,000 straight to principal on the land note, set $2,000 into a 6-month treasury at 10.4%, and kept $520 cash in the operating account as a discipline marker. No applause followed. No one in town tracked principal prepayments. 1983 began with tighter export demand and nervous lending desks, yet Hank treated it as a pricing problem, not a personal insult. He forward contracted only 42% of expected wheat at $3.42 per bushel, left the rest open, and cut diesel use with shorter haul routing and coordinated trips that saved 312 gallons across planting and harvest. The old 1969 truck crossed 336,000 miles that fall, still wired shut at the tailgate, still parked beside newer models worth more than his first acreage purchase. In July, he bought a 32,000-bushel on-farm storage setup from a retiring operator for $18,600 cash, then spent $2,240 rewiring motors and replacing sweep augers. The same capacity new would have cost him $41,900 plus installation and finance charges. Storage gave him timing power. He sold 18,400 bushels in staggered winter lots at an average 37 cents per bushel above harvest bids, adding $6,808 to revenue with no extra acres planted. At year-end, his net gain reached $19,340, and he directed $11,000 to reserve, $6,500 to land principal, and $1,840 to deferred shop concrete repair he had postponed for 3 seasons. Then he wrote his first fast ledger run in a format Earl liked, each line short, each line accountable. 1984. Bought adjoining 40 acres at $590 per acre, total $23,600, down payment $9,440 cash, 7-year fixed 9.1% on $14,160, annual payment near $2,760. 1985, net farm loss $18,300 after yield collapse and weak Milo prices, sold 120 steers early for liquidity, canceled non-critical building work, met every note without extension. 1986, refinanced nothing, paid down both land notes by combined $8,200 above schedule. 1987, bought 80 acres from an estate at $710 per acre, total $56,800, down $22,720, fixed 8.4% on balance, annual debt service $6,700 to $40. 1988, household spending held to $17,980 despite income rebound, directed $14,300 to principal. 1989, Treasury ladder balance reached $49,000 across staggered maturities. Emergency cash and equivalents covered 14 months of operating costs. The sequence looked plain on paper. In practice, it was compounding optionality while appearing undercapitalized. Before we go any further, if you want to know how this exact arithmetic later allows Hank to close on the last 400 acres in one day, subscribe and stay with the full record. The numbers only get sharper from here. The men and women around him were not careless caricatures. They were capable producers working under a prevailing consensus that scale had to be financed quickly or not at all. Leon Murray expanded to 320 rented acres, then 480, carrying equipment packages structured with teaser terms that looked manageable in good price years. In 1984, his annual debt service sat around $64,200, heavy but serviceable, with strong yields. By 1986, after one refinance and a balloon reset from 11.5% to 16.75%, annual service rose by $22,840, from roughly $64,200 to $87,040, before major repairs and rent adjustments. Leon was not spending on luxuries. He was feeding a structure that had no tolerance for two bad seasons close together. He worked longer hours than anyone accusing him ever acknowledged. The math still turned against him. Maria Gutierrez, operating near Hutchinson, chose finance deficiency after 2 strong years made expansion look rational. She took 2 combines on notes priced at 14.2%, betting that harvest throughput would reduce weather risk and custom delay losses. Her projected gain was real on paper. About $36,000 more annual capacity value if yields held and if she avoided breakdown clusters. The failure point was timing and rate load. When wheat quality discounts hit and a late storm cost her contracted volume, she missed 1 payment, then 2, then 3. Her lender moved from restructuring language to recovery language in less than 5 months. She did not fail because she lacked skill. She failed because small shocks in sequence reached fixed obligations too quickly. Dale and Ruth Penner, in Cloud County, made a choice many advisors were praising at the time. Stack operating credit to preserve scale during temporary downturns, then earn out once prices normalized. Their operating debt climbed to $418,000 after 2 failed wheat years, with interest expense consuming cash that had once covered seed and diesel. They sold equipment first, then breeding stock, then parcels they had hoped to keep for their daughter Elise. Curtis Hall bought land at $2,900 per acre, near the top of local optimism, improved drainage, pushed yield, and still got trapped when appraisals dropped to $1,950 per acre, leaving collateral values below outstanding exposure at renewal. He auctioned out with dignity and a voice that did not shake until the last lot. The room was quiet because everyone knew he had worked hard. Hard work was never the disputed variable. By the second week of August 1985, the crisis was no longer an argument between cautious and aggressive operators. It was weather, rates, and commodity weakness arriving in the same room. Kansas yields were uneven, sorghum bids softened, and lenders who had marketed flexibility began tightening covenants. Hank posted his own loss that year, the full $18,300 he had projected in worst-case worksheets, and the loss hurt. He sold those 120 steers early, took a lower margin, and kept liquidity above note requirements. He deferred paint, siding, and 1 bin door replacement. He did not defer filters, bearings, or tax obligations. His total annual fixed debt remained under $19,000, and because that figure was bounded years earlier, the bad season damaged pride more than solvency. Travis Cole called twice that winter with a bridge package built around variable rate machinery refinancing and delayed principal features. Hank declined both times in fewer than 10 words. In 1986 and 1987, rate pressure remained high enough to expose anyone carrying floating obligations. Hank did one thing that looked old-fashioned and proved strategic. He converted any unavoidable short-term exposure into fixed schedules as soon as he could, even when fixed terms were not cheap. Cheap was not his metric. Survivable was his metric. He also pushed a disciplined sale calendar from storage, moving grain in 6 tranches rather than one, and averaged prices that improved gross by 21 cents per bushel over harvest bids on 22,000 bushels, adding $4,620. That was not a miracle. It was controlled timing enabled by paid-for capacity. Across 1986 and 1987, he applied $14,940 extra to principal and let Treasury maturities roll into reserve rather than celebration purchases. When neighbors asked why he still did not upgrade the truck, he told them the same line he used with himself. Chrome does not reduce risk. Travis remained the loudest advocate for urgency. At county events, he spoke in confident, polished blocks about modern scale, speed, and market share. His argument was not irrational inside a stable rate, rising price paradigm. The underlying trade-off was fragility to sequence risk, a non-trivial detail that brochures did not print in bold type. In one co-op lot conversation, he pointed to Hank's patched overalls and said, "Caution had become identity." Hank answered without heat, "Caution is not my identity. Ownership is." He then climbed into the Chevrolet, now at 349,000 miles, and drove back to fields that did not know or care about status signaling. 3 days passed before Leon called Hank after another lender meeting. The call was short, factual, and tired. The reset had landed, operating room was shrinking, and one 160-acre block with family history attached was now exposed if terms did not improve. Hank drove down that evening with a yellow pad and no lecture prepared. They sat at the table where they had once avoided this conversation at Thanksgiving. Hank listed Leon's obligations, wrote projected cash under conservative price assumptions, and drew a hard sequence. Preserve core ground, liquidate high-cost machinery first, renegotiate rent on weakest acres, stop adding financed iron, and target annual payment load below 1/3 of stressed net cash flow. Leon stared at the page for a long time and said, "I should have asked sooner." Hank answered, "You asked now." It was enough for that night. By harvest 1988, the damage across the region had a human map attached to it. Leon lost the 160-acre owned tract when negotiations failed and sale timing collapsed under debt pressure, yet he retained a working path on rented acres after painful downsizing. Maria transitioned to smaller equipment and custom scheduling while she fought to keep her operation intact. Dale and Ruth left full-scale ownership and took management roles to stabilize income, with Elise holding on to the goal of buying family ground back someday. Curtis moved from owner-operator to hired technical work, repairing what others could not diagnose, and that skill kept him anchored in the same communities where he had once bid as a buyer. Hank kept farming his acres, paying down fixed notes, and buying only when terms stayed inside his framework. No one called that glamorous. It was not meant to be. By the first week of November 1989, the arithmetic was undeniable even to people who still disliked his methods. Hank controlled more titled land than most of the men who had once called him too cautious, and he had reached that position while taking fewer existential swings. His balance sheet showed moderate debt, rising equity, and liquidity that could absorb another poor year without forced sale. He still lived in the unpainted house. He still wore repaired work clothes. He still parked the same truck outside the same grain office. But inside his notebooks, the central tension had resolved into a working model. Debt was useful only when bounded, fixed, and subordinate to survival. Land ownership was slow until it was decisive, and dignity required that he remember every name of every family who had been cornered by the opposite sequence. In his ledger, resilience and responsibility were now written on the same line. In his ledger, resilience and responsibility were now written on the same line, and he kept writing even when no one was watching. Through 1990, 1991, 1992, and 1993, he treated each season as a controlled trial rather than a verdict on his identity. He sold grain in staggered lots, rolled treasury maturities instead of spending windfalls, and refused 3 separate machinery offers that would have pushed fixed obligations above his own ceiling. By the second week of January 1994, the call came before daylight from Earl Jensen's nephew. Earl had died in his sleep. After the funeral, Earl's family handed Hank 2 ledger notebooks tied with twine and a folded sheet with one sentence underlined twice in dark pencil. "Land paid for does not panic." Hank read it at his kitchen table, then rewrote his acquisition rules on a clean page, not as caution anymore, but as a long horizon framework. He made the framework visible in annual entries that anyone could audit. 1995. Bought 80 acres at $640 per acre, total $51,200, paid cash from retained earnings. 1996. No land purchase. Directed $27,400 to note reduction and storage upgrades. 1997. Sold winter wheat and milo in 5 tranches. Average price lift 29 cents per bushel over harvest bids on 26,300 bushels. Additional revenue, $7,627. 1998. Bought 120 acres at $800 to $20 per acre. Total $98,400. Down payment $49,200. 5-year fixed note on $49,200 at 7.1%. Annual debt service $11,928. 1999. Household spending closed at $24,440, below his cap. Surplus to principal $33,100. 2000. No new machinery financing. Rebuilt header for $3,860 instead of replacing at quoted $31,700. 2001. Reserve and treasuries. Crossed $310,000. 2002. Drought year. Net down sharply. No forced sale. No missed obligation. 2003. Bought 160 acres at $1,150 per acre. Total $184,000. Paid cash after 3 strong sorghum seasons and disciplined grain timing. The community still read his outward life as narrow. The house stayed plain. The truck stayed old. By October 2004, the 1969 Chevrolet had crossed 400 to 1,000 miles, with a replacement bench seat from a salvage yard and the same tailgate wire solution reworked twice. Meanwhile, the arithmetic under that appearance kept widening. From 2004 through 2008, he held household spending near $24,600 per year, sometimes a little lower, sometimes a little higher, while comparable operators in his county averaged around $80,000 in combined household and consumer debt service. The yearly spread was roughly $55,400. Over 20 years, that spread redirected $1,108,000 into land principal, grain handling, and cash equivalents. He was not living small because he could not grow. He was living modestly to buy options that did not carry interest risk. In 2009, as distressed estates began moving parcels under pressure, he bought 200 acres at $1,780 per acre. Total $356,000, structured for a 36-month payoff, and cleared in 32 months with operating surplus and storage margin gains. By 2015, he controlled enough contiguous and near-contiguous tracks that routing efficiency alone cut seasonal fuel and labor burden by an estimated $38 per acre across core ground. He never turned that into a speech. He just kept entering numbers. Then came August 2022 at the Reno County Courthouse auction, where the final 400-acre block adjoining his scattered tracts opened at $2.4 million and drew an investor group backed by short-term bridge financing. Travis Cole stood with them in a pressed shirt and a new truck parked across the street, still projecting urgency as if urgency itself were equity. Hank arrived in the same faded cap, same patched work shirt, and the old Chevrolet now reading 468,000 miles. 6 rounds moved fast. The room thinned to 3 bidders, then 2. The investor group pushed to $2.76 million, with confidence built on approved leverage. Hank waited through a pause long enough for whispering to start, then bid $2.84 million flat. The auctioneer called once, twice, and sold. A clerk asked for proof of funds under same-day settlement terms. Hank set 2 cashier's checks on the table with supporting letters and signed settlement documents without performance. Total liquid proof on file came to $3.36 million in audited cash and near-cash instruments. His debt-to-asset ratio, verified in the closing packet, sat below 0.07. Travis stepped into the hallway, called the bank that issued the checks, and asked for confirmation in a voice everyone near the door could hear. He listened, said thank you, returned to the room, and went quiet for several seconds. Then he looked at Hank and said, in front of bidders and clerks, "I spent 20 years selling urgency to a man who sold patience." No one clapped. They just absorbed it. Let me stop here and ask you something. When pressure tells you to move faster than your numbers allow, what are you really buying? And what is that speed going to cost when conditions turn? Hank never answered that in theory. He answered it in settlements that cleared without negotiation. The wealth revelation did not change his wardrobe, his truck, or his kitchen. It changed what he could do for other people without putting himself at risk. After consolidation, his documented net worth reached $9.8 million across 1,240 owned acres, grain inventory, and cash equivalents. Land value at conservative appraisal, $7,688,000. Grain and stored inventory at period pricing, $1,140,000. Cash and treasury ladders, $972,000. Equipment, tools, and improvements, net of depreciation. The remaining balance to full statement value, with liabilities held low enough to keep leverage muted. He launched Murray Grounded Futures with a $2 million endowment and 1 operational rule set. 0 interest, 5-year operating loans capped at $75,000, mandatory monthly ledger reporting, and each recipient required to mentor 1 younger producer for at least 2 seasons. Maria Gutierrez was one of the first approvals. She received $68,000, not as rescue theater, but as a line item restart. $31,400 for inspected used harvest equipment, $14,600 for input prepaid discounts, $9,800 for overdue service and transport liabilities, and $12,200 as protected working reserve she could not touch without joint review. Her previous failure had come from fixed load and timing shock. This structure attacked both points directly. Within 18 months, she was current on every obligation. By year 3, she had rebuilt enough stability to mentor 2 younger operators on maintenance scheduling and cash settlement discipline. Dale and Ruth Penner did not ask for charity and did not receive charity language. Their daughter Elise wanted one thing: to buy back 120 family acres they had lost under operating debt pressure years earlier. Hank structured 2 layers. Through the fund, Elise received a $75,000 zero-interest operating line to stabilize production. Separately, Hank carried a $210,000 structured land note on favorable fixed terms tied to cash flow milestones rather than punitive resets. The acreage returned to Penner family control with legal title protections that prevented predatory refinancing during the first 7 years. Dale moved into advisory work on soil and rotation planning. Ruth took over record systems for the family operation and later taught bookkeeping sessions through the county extension hall. Neither posture was triumph. It was restoration. Curtis Hall, whose auction had once silenced a room, received a different form of backing. Hank issued a $145,000 grant to establish a cooperative repair barn in Cloud County, with Curtis as manager and technical lead. The barn ran on a membership model: low annual dues, transparent parts pricing, shared diagnostic equipment, and training nights for younger mechanics. In its first 24 months, the co-op completed 312 repairs at average cost reductions of 42%, compared with dealer-quoted replacements. That translated into hundreds of thousands of dollars not borrowed by farms already operating near the edge. Curtis did not return to land ownership immediately. He returned to economic agency, then built from there. Leon Murray's thread took the longest and carried the most family weight. Hank leased him 200 acres at below-market rates with explicit debt reduction triggers. If Leon reduced high-interest obligations by set annual targets, lease terms remained favorable. If he drifted back into costly structures, terms reset toward market. The arrangement preserved dignity because it was contractual, not paternal. By the 3rd annual review, Leon had eliminated 2 expensive notes, restored vendor terms, and projected full solvency in 3 additional years if discipline held. At a family supper, he said only one line about it: "Steady feels different now." Hank nodded and passed the potatoes. If you are learning something from this record, keep following closely, because the deeper arithmetic is where the moral argument becomes measurable rather than sentimental. The deeper examination began with Hank's own 20-year household and capital discipline, and then moved through recipient outcomes. From 2000 through 2019, household expenses averaged $24,603 annually. Over the same period, average regional peer spending plus consumer debt service ran near $80,000 for operations of similar scale. Difference: $55,397 per year, multiplied by 20 years, $1,107,940 in deployable capital retained. Of that retained capital, his ledgers show $600,000 to $12,000 applied to land principal acceleration, $286,000 to storage and handling infrastructure, and $209,940 rolled through treasury ladders and reserve protection. Those allocations lowered forced sale probability, improved sale timing margins, and reduced financing dependence in down cycles. Then came acquisition arithmetic. The first 40 acres in 1978 cost $28,000 with $11,200 down. The 80 acres in 1995 cost $51,200 cash. The 120 in 1998 cost $98,400 with half down and fixed 7.1%. The 160 in 2003 cost $184,000 cash. The 200 in 2009 cost $356,000 with 36-month payoff. The final 400 in 2022 cost $2,840,000, settled same day. Cumulative purchase basis on those highlighted tracks, $3,557,600. Nice. Conservative value on those same tracks by post-2022 local benchmarks, materially higher, with appreciation only part of the story. The decisive factor was survival through periods that removed leveraged competitors from the field. Recipient trajectories added the multiplier effect. Maria's restart preserved her operation and created two mentee pathways. Elise's structured return of 120 acres restored an intergenerational asset, while her operating discipline reduced reliance on volatile credit. Curtis's repair barn lowered regional capital burn and kept producers from converting maintenance problems into financing traps. Leon's lease-to-solvency framework stabilized family acreage use and rebuilt his balance sheet without public humiliation. Through the first 5 years of Murray-grounded futures, total deployed assistance across loans, grants, and structured notes reached $1,184,000, with repayment and revolving flows increasing available support capacity each cycle. 12 active recipient operations under the program, and its extensions collectively managed 3,460 acres by the latest reporting year. At a conservative average of $4,700 per acre, that land base represented $16,262,000 in controlled productive asset value, influenced by one man's refusal to confuse image with strength. Travis Cole resolved his own arc in numbers as well. He shifted dealership emphasis toward inspected used inventory, transparent repair versus replace counseling, and fixed-rate planning support rather than rate-sensitive urgency packages. Commission income dipped during the first 2 years of transition, then stabilized as repeat trust replaced one-time pressure sales. At a county ag panel, he credited the courthouse auction in plain terms. That was when he stopped selling monthly optimism and started selling survivable plans. Hank did not comment on the statement. He had fields to check, notes to review, and one old truck to keep running. The week after that panel, Hank drove to the Murray Grounded Futures office, a converted 2-room space behind the old scale house, and signed the first annual compliance packet with the same pen he used for seed contracts. He insisted every loan file include 3 physical items: borrower ledger pages, monthly cash flow statements, and proof that required mentee hours were completed. No speeches, no glossy brochures, just records any lender in the county could audit. He told the coordinator one line and went back outside. If the numbers are clean, the people can breathe. On March 3, 2023, the office log showed 9 active files and $412,000 committed across zero-interest loans, grants, and structured notes. Hank wrote the figure in the margin and underlined the word committed, not promised. At 7:10 that morning, he opened Maria Gutierrez's folder first, then Elise Penner's, then Curtis Hall's grant ledger, because he wanted the highest risk files reviewed before coffee cooled. The coordinator asked whether she should draft a quarterly update for banks and board members. Hank said yes, but only from posted figures already reconciled to receipts. Maria Gutierrez's $68,000 package had monthly principal targets of $1,133.33 over 60 months, but her cycle was harvest-heavy, so the note allowed uneven payments if annual principal reached at least $13,600. In year 1, she paid $14,200. In year 2, she paid $15,000. On August 29, 2025, after a stronger wheat finish and better timing on diesel prepay, she posted $16,400 for year 3. She cleared the remaining balance in month 47. The practical result mattered more than speed. She stayed current with suppliers, rebuilt vendor trust, and moved from emergency buying to planned buying. At her October 2025 mentoring check-in, Maria laid out 2 binders beside the office adding machine and said she could now predict repair costs 1 season ahead instead of 1 week behind. By the end of that 3rd season, her average machinery repair cost per acre had dropped from $74 to $46 because she shifted from breakdown response to preventive maintenance. She completed required mentoring with Tom Alvarez and Jessa Nolan, 2 seasons each, and both submitted debt plans reducing variable rate exposure below 15% of annual obligations. Maria still refused triumphal language. "I'm not a success story," she said. "I'm current." Elise Penner's trajectory moved slower because land restoration always does. Her $75,000 zero-interest operating line, paired with Hank's separate $210,000 structured land note at fixed 3.2% over 15 years, no balloon, annual prepayment allowed without penalty. Required annual land payment came to $17,640, including principal and interest, and she set her budget to hit $22,000 in good years to shorten note life. On December 18, 2023, she paid exactly $22,000. On December 20th, 2024, after mixed yields, she still paid $18,200. On December 22nd, 2025, she returned to $23,500. That sequence brought principal down faster than schedule and kept stress low enough to avoid reactive borrowing. Dale Penner, who once signed foreclosure papers with steady hands and a strained jaw, now handles soil plans and field maps for the restored 120 acres. Ruth Penner ran monthly reconciliations at the same kitchen table where they had once separated bills into what could be paid and what had to wait. In the second week of September 2025, Elise filed her 3rd annual report with no covenant breach, no missed term, and 2 younger producers rotating through her own mentoring calendar. Curtis Hall's Repair Co-op became the quiet center of the program's multiplier effect. Hank's $145,000 grant paid for diagnostic equipment, lift upgrades, and an inventory system tracking failure patterns by model year and service interval. Curtis set pricing at parts plus an 11% service margin, enough to keep the shop solvent without pushing members into replacement purchases. On the 24-month closeout sheet, the barn had completed 312 repairs at an average 42% lower cost than dealer replacement quotes. Curtis signed each page, then initialed the grant compliance line without being asked. By May 2026, another batch of completed tickets sat in 3 gray crates near the co-op's back wall. The barn had added 241 repairs over the following 18 months, and monthly meetings kept redirecting farmers away from panic purchases toward staged maintenance. Those savings were not abstract. They kept cash available for seed, rent, and note service instead of forcing emergencies onto credit cards or short-term lines. Curtis hired 2 apprentices from families that had nearly exited agriculture during the debt squeeze years. Every training night attendance sheet reached the fund office on time because Hank required documentation before any renewal. Leon Murray remained the most delicate file because family history could distort accountability if rules were not explicit. Hank prevented that by drafting the lease as if Leon were any other tenant. Base rent sat at $61 per acre on 200 acres, while local market ranged from $89 to $97, and the $28 to $36 spread had one required destination: high-interest debt reduction. Leon provided quarterly statements proving rent savings went to principal on obligations above 9%. In year one, he cut expensive debt from $186,000 to $139,400. In year two, he reached $92,300. On June 30th, 2026, Leon's third-year report closed at $57,800 high-interest balance, and he had moved his last variable operating note into a fixed 3-year schedule. He did not recover the lost 160-acre tract from the 1980s, but the arithmetic no longer ran against him. The reviewer's note read, "Final year solvency trajectory intact. Projected completion still within the original 3-year post-setup window." At family meals, the tension thinned into ordinary conversation about weather and cattle feed. No one pretended the old years had been easy. They were simply no longer running the house. The fund's own books moved forward the same way Hank managed crops: staged entries, dated decisions, no cosmetic rounding. On December 31st, 2024, cumulative deployment stood at $846,000. On December 31st, 2025, it stood at $1,012,000. At the October 2026 compliance review, cumulative deployment reached $1,128,000, with repayments replenishing the revolving pool on schedule and administrative expense holding at 1.9%, because reporting stayed standardized and staffing stayed lean. Mentorship pairings kept compounding. Several former mentees had already entered the queue as first-time mentors. On August 31st, 2027, the Year 5 close was posted and signed. $1.184 million deployed across loans, grants, and structured notes, with 12 active operations managing 3,460 acres under program-linked discipline. The acreage base matched prior reports. The difference was structure. Average fixed-rate share across participating balance sheets had risen from 48% to 79%, and average annual debt service as a share of stressed net cash flow had fallen from 52% to 29%. That ratio change explained why phone calls shifted from emergency extensions to planned inputs and timed repairs. Travis Cole watched those numbers from a different seat than he had occupied in 1981. He did not leave the business, and he did not reinvent himself in one dramatic week. In early 2023, he started with inventory policy, moving the dealership from heavily promoted new packages toward inspected used equipment with repair histories attached. By summer, he required every sales contract above $40,000 to include a written payment stress worksheet showing outcomes at lower commodity prices. He also began offering fixed-rate counseling sessions with no purchase requirement and no commission credit attached. In the first 2 years, gross commission income at his location dropped 27%. More than one peer told him he was voluntarily shrinking. He kept going. By year 3, repeat customer retention rose from 41% to 68%, delinquency disputes fell, and service revenues stabilized because customers arrived with maintenance plans instead of panic deadlines. At a regional dealer meeting in Wichita, he repeated the sentence he had said at the courthouse. He had sold urgency for too long. This time he added one more line. "I do not want a customer who can only survive my best-case forecast." His relationship with Hank settled into something practical and unadorned. On a wet April morning in 2026, they stood near the parts counter, reviewing a list of used components for a producer who needed a repair-first option rather than a new note. Neither man acted sentimental about the shift. The resolution was visible in behavior, not speeches. Travis stopped using public pressure language at auctions and co-op meetings. Hank stopped being the cautionary example and became the reference point for survivable planning. Younger sales staff learned to read debt service before paint color. By the first week of March 2027, the office roll call could be read from current records without guessing. Hank Murray, 73, still lived in the same unpainted farmhouse outside Concordia, still wore patched work shirts, still tracked costs line by line, and still held title to the first 40 acres and the last 400 within 1,240 owned acres. The 1969 Chevrolet C20, now past 480,000 miles, remained registered and operational, tailgate secured by a cleaner version of the old wire and chain fix. The rebuilt 4430 from 1981 remained in seasonal use for lighter tillage and grain cart work. The same page listed names that once appeared in separate stories and now sat in one operating ledger. Earl Jensen remained where he had been since 1994, buried on the hill above town, with his ledgers preserved in archival sleeves in the fund office. Leon Murray farmed under his debt reduction lease path and stayed current on every term. Maria Gutierrez operated independently and served on the fund review committee one evening each month. Dale and Ruth Penner lived on the restored family place, no longer owners of what they once held at peak, but no longer displaced and no longer financially cornered. Elise Penner held title protections and payment momentum on the 120 acres she fought to recover. Curtis Hall managed the repair barn and trained mechanics who could read both engines and balance sheets. Travis Cole ran a dealership model that no longer treated leverage as identity. At co-op counters and courthouse steps, people still noticed fresh paint. But respect had moved toward liquidity, fixed terms, paid for acreage, and the ability to help a neighbor without waiting on a bank committee. Hank never upgraded his personal life to match appraisal figures and never had to explain why. On March 9th, 2027, after the day's entries were balanced, the coordinator asked whether to archive that week's reports in the public file or keep them in the internal cabinet until quarter close. Hank told her to file them where any participating family could read them. Arithmetic shouldn't hide, he said, sliding Maria's cleared note receipt and Leon's quarterly statement into separate folders. He locked the drawer, checked the wall calendar for next month's mentoring reviews, and left the office lights on only in the front room, where the copier still warmed the air. Near sunset that same day, Hank parked the Chevrolet at the edge of the first 40 acres, walked to the fence line, and stood where the ground rose enough to see the far boundary of the last 400. Wind moved through dry stalks and winter grass with the same steady sound it had made in 1978. The titles were in his name. The notes were controlled. The fund files were current. Across those fields, wealth looked exactly the way it had always looked on him. Worn denim, quiet math, and land that did not panic. The next morning, the front room file cabinet stood open by Hank's instruction, and people who had never seen the inside of a lending office walked in, took a seat, and read their own numbers on paper that did not hide behind polished language. Maria arrived at 8:12 with 2 binders, a coffee thermos, and Tom Alvarez beside her. She laid out her payment history in order, each receipt clipped to a monthly expense sheet, then slid over her mentoring completion forms. Tom's first-year operating debt had been $94,600 with 38% on variable terms. After 2 seasons under Maria's maintenance calendar and cash timing plan, he had reduced it to $61,200 and cut variable exposure to 12%. Jessa Nolan came in 10 minutes later and added her own update. Diesel prepay savings of $3,480, repair cost per acre down from $69 to $44, and one avoided emergency line draw that would have carried 13.9%. Hank read each page in silence, made 3 check marks in pencil, and signed the annual compliance line at the bottom. By the 3rd week of April 2026, Elise Penner sat at that same office table, with Ruth on her right and Dale standing by the window with a folded hat in his hands. The structured land note statement showed principal reduced to $168,660 after 3 years, with every payment posted on or before due date. Elise brought a cashier's check for $24,000 and a typed request to apply $6,360 above required payment directly to principal. Hank reviewed her debt service worksheet under stressed pricing, saw annual obligation holding below 30% of conservative net cash flow, and approved a new step she had earned, an option to purchase an additional 40-acre buffer parcel if she could bring 40% down and keep fixed terms under 6.0%. She did not smile until she had the signed page in her hand. Then she looked at Dale and Ruth, and all 3 of them exhaled at once like people setting down a load they had carried for years. Curtis Hall's repair barn reached its busiest month in June 2026, with 41 completed jobs, and the scene on training night felt like a county fair for practical people. Engines open, torque charts taped to posts, apprentices calling out part numbers while older farmers compared worn bearings like doctors comparing scans. Curtis stood at the whiteboard and read out the quarter figures. Average savings versus dealer replacement quotes, 39%. Emergency financing avoided by members this quarter, $118,400. Total co-op repairs since launch, 623. Apprentices retained into paid positions, 4. Hank stayed in the back by the tool cages and watched 2 19-year-olds rebuild a hydraulic valve body instead of signing for new equipment they did not need. One of them was Jess's younger cousin. The arithmetic had become culture, which was always the harder part. Leon's decisive meeting happened on September 30th, 2026, at the same kitchen table, where he had once said he should have asked sooner. This time he came with a clean folder and a voice that did not carry panic. Quarterly statements showed high-interest debt above 9% reduced to 0. The remaining obligations were fixed, scheduled, and covered by projected cash flow, even under poor price assumptions. Hank reviewed the lease triggers line by line and then set down a new document, already drafted. It converted 80 of the 200 leased acres into a 15-year purchase contract at $2,150 per acre, with 35% down required, fixed 4.6% on the balance, and one covenant Leon accepted without argument. Annual debt service could not exceed 1/3 of stressed net cash flow. Leon read it twice, signed, and stared at his signature for a moment. "Steady," he said again, quieter than before. Hank answered, "Keep it that way." On December 31st, 2026, Murray Grounded Futures closed its ledger year in public session. Deployed capital stood at $1,184,000 across program years 1 through 5. Revolving repayments had restored $406,000 back into available pool. Net active exposure sat at $778,000 across 12 operating families. Those 12 operations managed 3,460 acres combined. At a conservative $4,900 per acre benchmark, productive asset value tied to program participants reached $16,954,000. The multiplier was no longer theoretical. One endowment had turned into a regional stabilizer with documented cash flow discipline, lower variable rate dependence, and fewer forced sales. The quarterly update, once requested for banks and board members, had become a standard packet. Two local banks now used in their own risk counseling meetings. Travis Cole's final arc settled in full view, not at an auction, but on a cold February afternoon in 2027 at his own dealership conference room. He had called 15 producers for a free planning clinic and put no sales contracts on the table. Each attendee received a worksheet headed in plain block letters, Payment Stress Test. One column showed projected outcomes under average commodity prices, the next under stressed prices, 20% lower. He told the room he would not write a package that failed the second column. Commissions had dropped when he made that shift, then recovered as repeat customers returned with fewer defaults and stronger service plans. By the time of that March roll call, his location's contract delinquency rate had fallen from 11.4% to 3.1%, and used equipment turnover had become the healthiest line in his books. He later told a regional meeting he had retired urgency as a sales tactic. No one laughed. Too many had seen the alternative. 3 days after that clinic, Travis stopped by Hank's place with an inspected parts list for a young operator and stood by the old Chevrolet while Hank checked field notes. The truck still leaned slightly left. The tailgate still closed with wire and a better chain link, cleaned and retwisted every winter. Travis nodded at it and said, "You kept the evidence." Hank looked at the truck, then at the west field. "It kept me honest," he said. That was the whole exchange. It was enough to close 20 years of friction. By the first week of March 2027, the roll call that once sounded like separate losses now read like a connected system with names, numbers, and current status attached. Hank Murray, 73, still lived in the unpainted farmhouse outside Concordia, owned 1,240 acres, including the first 40 and the last 400. And carried low leverage with a debt-to-asset ratio still below 0.08 after new program commitments. His 1969 Chevrolet C20 remained registered and running past 486,000 miles. The rebuilt 4430 remained in seasonal service. Earl Jensen remained in the cemetery on the hill, and his ledger notebooks had been digitized, archived in sleeves and copied to the county historical room so younger producers could study the original handwriting. Maria Gutierrez was current, independent, and serving as a rotating reviewer for first-time applicants. Tom Alvarez had stabilized and leased an additional 60 acres without new variable rate exposure. Jessa Nolan had completed her second full season with no emergency borrowing. Dale and Ruth Penner managed records and soil plans on restored family ground, and Elise held title protection on 120 acres while advancing principal faster than schedule. Curtis Hall expanded the co-op to a second service bay and hired one of Leon's nephews as an apprentice. Leon Murray had moved from survival to structured ownership, current on all terms and operating without high-interest debt. Travis Cole ran a dealership model that rewarded durability over showmanship and trained younger staff to read cash flow risk before discussing paint color. There were small callbacks only locals noticed. The grain clerk who once softened his voice with Hank now sent new borrowers to the public file room before discussing credit products. One of the two men who had paused behind Hank at the fertilizer counter in 1982 eventually joined the fund's volunteer review panel and admitted he had judged by clothing before reading a balance sheet. The loaded silence from old coffee shop circles never turned into formal apology, but it did turn into changed behavior at auctions, co-op lines, and kitchen tables across 2 counties. That was enough. If you want more stories where arithmetic beats appearances, subscribe and stay with this channel. Write in the comments the one rule you would put on your own balance sheet before signing any note. Share this with one person who works hard, looks ordinary, and is being underestimated because their life does not look polished. Near sunset that same day, in the first week of March 2027, Hank parked at the same fence line again, boots in winter grass, cap brimmed down against the wind. Behind him sat an old truck most strangers would still dismiss. In front of him lay titled ground, current ledgers, paid mentors, repaired machines, and neighbors who could breathe because one man chose fixed terms over fast pride. The first 40 acres and the last 400 held the same lesson in different scale. Wealth had never been the shine. It had always been the resilience.